topic which we haven't discussed before, a perspective which no one has shown you before. Discussing this topic, I will take us to the next level of dot connecting. It won't be just my opinion. You guys will listen to these guys and what they say make you think in a different way and look around you and understand how these are actually being implemented.
And so reliability is the number one property, and it means that these systems are very slow to develop and evolve.
So reliability is important, and as we go forward, we will understand the domestic and international framework being laid out and why it is being laid out and what it is being laid out for.
There are also changes that are in the form of new features. One of the features that I think is very exciting is a feature that would allow people to launch, well, stablecoins are the obvious use case, but it's not just stablecoins. It's essentially assets pegged to some external value. Features similar to that exist on other systems, but the interesting thing about...
So that is something President Trump liked, right? So that is, as President Trump stated, greenback really needs to be backed with something. Isn't that cool? Because when we actually talk about that, we also see this one. National Science Foundation is actually funding a new group, and if you come to the bottom, you can actually see it's virtually equivalent of tapping gold to everyone's dollar bills, meaning you already have that dollar, you already are using that. Now they are trying to use this and support it with backing of a real monetary system. Okay, so if this has to be implemented, why they changed XRP into on-demand liquidity or ODL? Here's the explanation for that.
Similar to that exist on other systems, but the interesting thing about this is that the liquidity is guaranteed by the ledger mechanics.
Why is liquidity important for market stability and health then?
I think even to take a step back, liquidity has a lot of components that are important to kind of address. So one of which is immediacy. So I think about that as how quickly can I get access to markets and how quickly can I trade into and out of this asset or token for another asset. I think about the breadth of the market. So breadth is sort of...
So liquidity is one of the most important parameters of the financial system, and the ability to enter and exit the market quickly, that is what you get with XRP Ledger, because XRP Ledger allows you to do that in just 3 seconds. What else can you actually ask for as a regulator? Now, is it only Fed doing this? No. Oh no, we all know that. But the question is, how will this actually play out in the global arena?
And Ripple has been engaging with lots of central banks around the world. Why is Ripple doing that?
Well, you know, central banks are both regulators of their financial ecosystem, but also they operate the payment systems in their own countries. So when new technology like this comes along, they can be inhibitors of the use of that technology or really catalysts for innovation. So since Ripple is bringing new tech to the marketplace, central banks are critical to our success.
How else is Ripple engaging with central banks?
Well, really 2 fronts. You know, one is on the policy side, folks like Ryan Zagonis, in their countries.
And what kind of results are you seeing in terms of adoption?
So for example, last year we partnered with SAMA, which is the central bank for Saudi Arabia, and that resulted in 4 major banks starting their digitization journey on RippleNet. Here, for example, Bahrain and Abu Dhabi Global Markets are leading the world in the development of regulatory frameworks for the use of crypto assets, and that's got to be a good thing for the ecosystem.
So if you actually had a doubt regarding the SAMA, which we talked yesterday, many were asking, is they like using RippleNet? Are they on RippleNet? You got the answer for that now. Now, the general talk about this actually is, so a blockchain startup connecting central banks across the globe in a new infrastructure to move value around all of them, right? And the central banks are dipping their toes into digital assets or crypto assets. They're bringing new regulations from the Middle East. So, the world will actually step in and they will do their own. So now domestic base is being laid out. International connectivity is coming. And with ISO 20022, that new standard, new infrastructure which provides interoperability to these central banks are here. Now, this is what I'm going to This can be a radical change from here, but keep this in mind. Domestic network from central banks to commercial banks are being built. Central banks are building interoperability within them. Okay, so now how is it actually playing out? Like, what time frame we can look at this, how this can evolve, or say, does this look forward? And when we look forward towards the implementation of this, how much time it will actually take to first complete this domestic level infrastructure?
Exciting sessions about new corridors that have been built within this region, but what was really stood out to me, at least, was the chatter about XRP. What do you think that means going forward?
Yeah, it's wonderful to see our customers asking the tough questions and really getting into the weeds on XRP. I think that's what stood out to me throughout the day is people are getting serious about adopting digital assets, and they want to know what the regulatory considerations they should keep in mind are. What are their peers thinking about this technology? If they are going to implement it in the next year or two, or in the next 6 months, like what should they have top of mind? So
they were really talking like it's going to happen in next 1 year or 2 years, or it can even happen in 6 months. And that was actually stated back in, last year, 2019, May. So if you take 1 year or 2 year, it's still 2021, May, June, say that quarter. So that's kind of not so far away. And we already talked about 2021, the ISO implementation and the interoperability coming in. Now, if you actually look at that, this domestic rails or the new plumbing, which is being laid out, is going to be functional by 2021, say the end of 2021 max. And this will actually lead to something even huge. Now, what we just discussed, if you focused and understood this, you now understand that there is two layers. Say, first infrastructure is connecting the domestic or central banks to the commercial banks within that country, and the next one goes to international, say commercial banks connecting via central banks to other central banks, and then towards again deviating into the domestic market. So that is kind of happening, right? I really actually don't want to give you guys the radical change, directly jumping to this. That's why I gave you the background to understand why this infrastructure is being laid out and what the future looks like. We haven't actually thought about this previously, but this is going to be so huge for XRP as an asset.
Yet again, at a moment when we need to adjust and change and improve. And this is so because the landscape is changing, the landscape is shifting, either due to geopolitical developments or due to economic shifts from west to east. Part of it is driven by new technologies.
So they are stating that the landscape is actually changing. It is not only due to the geopolitical situation, but a technology side, an innovation, a disruption is actually happening. So this is one of the primary reasons for this change in infrastructure. And where this is leading us to?
The international monetary system has undergone several transformations as it moved from the gold standard to the gold exchange standard to the dollar exchange standard of the Bretton Woods system, and finally to the current arrangement of flexible exchange rates. But yet through these transformations, there was a constant feature. It was always almost dominated by one currency. Before the First World War, it used to be sterling. After a turbulent dollar-sterling era between the two world wars, the dollar gained preeminence after the Second World War. And the reign of the dollars has survived the end of the Bretton Woods system in 1973, and it only came out stronger of the global financial crisis. At the same time, you see that you have new competitors that are entering the global currency game. So today, the dominance of the dollar makes the US the world's banker. As such, it enjoys exorbitant privileges, in the words of Valéry Giscard d'Estaing, but it also bears exorbitant duties. Directly and indirectly, it's the dominant supplier of safe and liquid assets to the rest of the world. It is the issuer of a dominant currency of trade invoicing. It is the dominant force in global monetary policy, and it is the main lender of last resort. And these features actually interact and reinforce each other. That the dollar dominates in trade invoicing makes it more attractive to borrow in dollars, and this in turn makes it more attractive to price in dollars. That the US is the main lender of last resort makes it safer to borrow in dollars, and this in turn increases the responsibility of the US in times of crisis.
That point should actually be well noted. Why? Because as we know now, countries, banks, every entities are kind of borrowing in terms of dollar, because dollar is a reserve currency, you can see. But what is the issue for the network being issued like this? Say for example, take an example of, let's take Europe. A bank in Europe borrows in dollar. Now during a crisis, the European Central Bank can actually print euro. That is actually okay for them. They can do that and give it to bank. But at that time, the bank will have to run to find dollar. They need liquidity and change that into dollar. So that's why the banks, central banks, actually put out a new system for them to interact with each other to directly get the dollars from Fed.
Solidify the position, the special position of the US in the current system. At the same time, not all is well in this dollar-centric international monetary system. There's a growing and seemingly insatiable global demand for safe assets. And the resulting global safe asset shortage has brought safe interest rate downs to a historically low levels.
So now you can see euro is trying to compete with dollar, yuan is trying to compete with dollar. Yuan even came up with the digital yuan, and it's actually working fine now for them. They've been implementing that. They'll get more control, for that regime. That's gonna be cool. And if they can actually interact with other countries, say India, Russia, or any other countries for this instance, they can kind of dominate in their trade without using dollar, right? So for US, that is not actually a good news. So in that perspective, when we actually go further in this, we can actually see something like this area.
Multipolar international monetary. So the international community can take concrete steps to prepare for these challenges. And I think the most actionable priority is to strengthen the global financial safety net. So some of that involves preserving and strengthening the ability of central banks and governments to act as lender of last resort in their own countries. Some measures involve creating decentralized arrangements between countries, such as reserve sharing agreements and bilateral swap line agreements between central banks.
Now, those statements should be actually kept in mind, because as we go forward, this is going to be so important from here onwards, because they itself is actually talking about a radical change which is actually coming towards us,
while at the same time increasing the support of the IMF to the decentralized system. These two things are complementary. And perhaps more radically, we can imagine a new expanded role for the IMF by adapting and modernizing some old ideas of what's called the CANT plan and the Triffin plan. For example, you could imagine that the IMF could centralize reserve sharing agreements by administering a new global reserve facility.
So now the fingers are pointing towards a new reserve facility. They are actually trying to facilitate new reserve. So that is actually happening. It's not like it's here, but it's actually happening in the background. So they actually talk about the same which we talked previously about, the example from the European Bank. If that is happening, then how they are actually suffering. Now, when we actually move through the video, we can actually reach a point where they really talk about what happens in the background, the swap lines. If you remember, like here I told you to keep these in mind, right? The reserve sharing, bilateral swap lines, domestic lender of last resort. So now when we actually move forward in this video, we can actually see this. This is like the previous swap lines, which is created from the Fed to other central banks, so that when there is a crisis, Fed can fund dollars to all the central banks, which requires that.
Trade peg agreements. As we get to the third type, we're getting closer and closer to the IMF types and roles. So to conclude, and as a radical suggestion, if you want, or as a suggestion better rather than a radical one, the IMF can certainly interact with the type 3, and a suggestion that I leave for the discussion is the IMF could show up as an intermediary between the Federal Reserve, since we're talking about dollars, and the other central banks. And I say as an intermediary because many countries, say India or Brazil, would enjoy benefiting from these swap lines, but do not because the Federal Reserve worries about sovereign risk. Well, the IMF could appear in the middle, take the sovereign risk by having a swap line with its SDR, say, and the dollar, and then give a swap line to the Indian rupee or the Brazilian real, therefore the IMF bearing the sovereign risk and setting margins based on the exchange rate risk, as is its expertise, assessing exchange rate risk, assessing sovereign risk. And
even when they're explaining that, did you hear the example which they picked? Brazil, India, where RippleNet is kind of there with the domestic bank, with the central bank. They're already working with all of them. Now, if you get this from the initial state, I was telling to focus, right? First, the domestic layer is being set up. Commercial banks is being connected to central banks. Now, the central banks are being connected to the central banks. Now, above all this, IMF is coming up with a new reserve facility, which will be connecting the Fed's swap lines, as we just saw here. Currently, the swap lines from the Fed actually runs something like this. It is kind of all around the world, connecting majority of the central banks. So if IMF is to replace this, it's not only the domestic markets which we are actually seeing, it's also the international shadow markets. Say, for example, we are not there, we can't see that, that's invisible. For example, Fed is giving trillions to European Central Bank, or Fed is funding all other different nations through dollar. Now this is being transferred from them to the other currency, right? So if IMF is to stand in between, take the dollar in a new reserve, say at that particular point, dollar will not be that, but they'll take it into a new digital asset and then transfer it to the country which requires it. So that transaction will be happening in seconds, first thing. So when we actually look back and what Ripple, the team stated previously, they are now looking at low volume, value, high frequency payment. So that is the domestic market if we look at that particularly. So in that, they build the base, that is the liquidity. If you follow the video well, you'll understand. First step is building this network, then building the liquidity, then bringing everyone in. So that domestic network is complete, and then you on to this, IMF will push this agenda inside. If you get this well, the price is going to be somewhere which we haven't even imagined. Now, when we say that, you really have to listen to the entire video and think about the points which I illustrated. And if you want to reiterate on that, go through that. If you want to read this article, go through that. You can just go to medium.com and you can find this. This is the title, just type in this title in Google, you can find this article. You can read it because it's kind of a good summary. You can play through it. It's giving you a lot more point. And if you actually followed the other points, you'll understand this is coming. And it's not like a fantasy or a radical change, even though we say that. It's happening and it's going to be implemented in 1 or 2 decades. If we are not ready, the asset price which we are looking now is so cheap and we won't even think that it may go to that price, because we were actually talking about trillions of dollars, quadrillions of dollars, but it was only in the domestic markets. Now, if the central banks, the shadow banks, the shadow market are to use this technology, then the price will be at some point being shooted up even way higher than Bitcoin. If you see someone stating XRP is too big to jail coin, I kind of agree with that. Even if they don't agree with all these, even if they don't want this to happen, it's happening in the background. IMF is backing that, World Bank is backing that. All the international organizations, like Bank of International Settlements, OECD, and everything is actually joining together along with the central banks and pushing this inside. Now, yes, we can be the victim and say that it's not good, we don't want this, or we can be an investor, take the opportunity and wait. The patience is required. Now, this is not going to happen tomorrow, next month, next year. If you're patient enough until this rolls out, if you're invested heavily, meaning, what you can afford, it's not like selling your home and putting the money here, being smart, then in a couple of decades, you're going to be one of the richest guys. Now, you can go through all the articles which we have presented here, do your own research and reinstate that, kind of reinforcing everything which we said. And if you have any different opinion, do let me know what you think about all these things.